The archaeological record suggests that before the end of the Bronze Age, several great kingdoms had developed in the eastern Mediterranean. They all died out suddenly at about the same time, within the space of a generation. Foremost among them was probably the Hittite Empire, with its capital in Hattusa. In the area of central and southern Greece were the Mycenaean states, known also as the Achaean or Danaan kingdoms. According to Hittite records, there was the kingdom of Ugarit in Syria, the kingdom of Alasia on Cyprus, Asua to the west of the Hittites, Isua to the east. In Asua or south of Asua were Azawa, and further south the land of Lucca or Lycia, whereas north of Asawa was Wilusa or Trousa, possibly the same kingdom as Troy that Homer calls Wilius and Troia. A people called Casca lived north of the Hittites, closer to the region of Caucasus. In between the Hittites and Ugarit was the land of the Carchemish. Far to the east were the lands of Mesopotamia, which at this point was falling under Assyrian rule, and furthest to the east among those lands was Elam, on the western side of the Zagros mountain range in what is today Persia. Its capital was called Susa. There were also several other smaller kingdoms which are less relevant for my story, and of course there was Egypt in the south. The Bronze Age began to collapse after a period of wars between the Hittites and their western neighbors. The Hittite records name two chief troublemakers. One was the king of the Ahia or Ahiawa, generally understood to be the same people as the Achaeans of the Homeric epics. Their king was named Atarasia, whose name I dare say reminds me of Atreus, the legendary father of King Agamemnon of Mycenae and King Menelaus of Sparta. It has all the right consonants in the correct order in both words, both in Hittite and in Greek. The other troublemaker was a man called Piamaradu. His name has evoked in some scholars a similarity with the legendary King Priam of Troy, the father of Hector and Paris. Priam and Atreus, the two kings, would have been contemporary in terms of the tradition of the epic cycle, just as Piamaradu and Atarasia were contemporaries according to Hittite records. According to the Hittite records, they had allied to cause much trouble to the Hittite king. Piamaradu was successful in defeating a Hittite army, thus establishing himself as ruler of Troy, even capturing the island of Lesbos, known as Laspa in the Hittite texts, off the coast of Asia Minor at around 1250 BC. The fortunes of the Hittites seemed to turn around, however, by 1210 BC or so, when the Hittite king in diplomatic correspondence refers to the ruler of Miletus as his son, possibly indicating that Miletus had become a Hittite vassal. Nearer the turn of the century, however, that is, closer to 1200 BC, Miletus rebelled again. Tudhaliya IV, the Hittite king at that time, defeated the leader of Miletus named as Tahonderadu in the Hittite texts. That is the last mention of the Ahiawa or Achaeans in the Hittite records. Soon after, the kingdom of Ugarit in northern Syria is known to have faced a serious threat. A letter from the Ugarit king Amurapi, possibly the Hammurabi of biblical texts, asks desperately for help from the king of Alasia in Cyprus. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here, my cities were burned, and they did evil things to my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is defenseless. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. The ruler of Al-Ashia, that is Cyprus, may have perceived this as an accusation of negligence on his behalf, and so he responded, "Concerning those enemies, it was the people from your country and your ships that did this. And it was the people from your country who committed these transgressions. I am writing to inform you and protect you. Be aware." It appears that at this time the ruler of the nearby region of Carchemish or Carchemish sent an army to assist Ugarit, but the army arrived too late. A letter from the king of Ugarit exclaims, "When your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated, and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burnt, and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it." An unnamed sea-born invader had destroyed one of the major kingdoms of the time. The sack of Ugarit has been dated to around 1190 BC. The attacker has not been established. The ubiquitous sea peoples have been blamed for this as for everything else. Considering that the first letter mentioned the army of Ugarit campaigning in Hittite land and the Ugaritic fleet being in Lycia, we may assume that a war had broken out between Ugarit and the Hittites and the satellites, and that Ugarit may have been the first victim in a large-scale war. The sack of Ugarit was the first disaster in a series of violent incidents that marked the end of the Bronze Age. Soon after the fall of Ugarit, the Hittites appear to have taken control of Cyprus. But at around 1180 BC, the Hittite Empire itself had collapsed, possibly after Hattusa was sacked by the Kaska people said to have lived in the direction of the Caucasus. At around the same time, Troy 7 appears to have been destroyed by a fire at the end of what might have been a siege, based on evidence such as some skeletons found under collapsed buildings and some missiles lying about. Troy remained deserted for a considerable time, possibly for 2 centuries. Eratosthenes, the ancient Greek geographer, candidly dated the sack of Troy to 1183 BC. The destruction of Troy 7 has been dated by modern methods to around 1180 to 1179 BC, that is, to around the same time suggested by Eratosthenes. This destruction of Troy happened at around the same time as the sack of Hattusa and about 10 years after the sack of Ugarit. At around the same time, some of the palaces of Achaean citadels are burned. Other Achaean cities and cities on Cyprus and elsewhere are abandoned, while the entire region becomes depopulated. A surviving clay tablet indicated that the city of Pylos, one of the centers of Mycenaean civilization, was attacked by a sea-borne invader at that time and was sacked. As a result, the greatest kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean were destroyed, all in the course of about 10 years or so. Are the Hittites to be found in the Homeric epics, in the Iliad and the Odyssey? The events described in the Homeric epics bear some very intriguing similarities with the events established by archaeology. The archaeological record suggests that the Trojans had formed a coalition at this time. Homer suggests the same. Priam rules in Troy when the Achaeans invade Asia, a word originally indicating the Hittite land of Asua, the region of classical Lydia, south of Troy. It is said by Homer that the Achaeans sailed out of Aulis in Greece first to attack the citadel of Teuthranea, which is indeed in Asia, in Lydia, and which at the time was defended by a local ruler named Telephus. The Hittite texts mention instead a ruler called Telepinu, whom Huxley in 1960 compared with Homeric Telephus. Again, the letters, one by one, the consonants are the same in both Greek and Hittite. The Achaeans were victorious in their first siege and sacked Teuthranea. Some years later, possibly as many as 9 to 10 years later, the Achaeans turned their attention to Troy. The sage Calchas is said to have watched a snake devour a bird and its 8 nestlings and had prophesied that 9 years would pass before Troy itself would fall on the 10th year of the war. Achilles and Odysseus are often called by Homer sackers of cities, and Achilles is said to have sacked 29 cities before coming to Troy, which certainly gives the impression of a great and long war. In the course of that war, the son of Achilles, Neoptolemus, faces a hero and Trojan ally called Eurypylus, the son of Telephus, possibly the same Telephus who had unsuccessfully defended Teuthranea some years earlier. In talking to Achilles in the Odyssey, Odysseus says, "I can tell you the truth about your son Neoptolemus, for I took him in my own ship from Scyros with the Achaeans. In our councils of war before Troy, he was always first to speak, and his judgment was unerring. Nestor and I were the only 2 who could surpass him, and when it came to fighting on the plain of Troy, he would never remain with the body of his men, but would dash on far in front, foremost of them all in valor. Many of men did he kill in battle. I cannot name every single one of those whom he slew while fighting on the side of the Argives, but I will only say how he killed that valiant hero Eurypylus, son of Telephus, who was the handsomest man I ever saw, except Memnon. Many others also of the Cettians fell around him." The Greek text reads as follows. The Cettians are spelled as Kati or Kitioi. Huxley in 1960 had already suggested that these men who fell with Eurypylus were Hittites. Another scholar, Jorrit Kelder, more recently repeated again Huxley's original observation. The word Hittite comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, originally written in Hebrew, where an ancient people are referred to with the name Hette or Hetteoi or Het in Greek. In Egyptian inscriptions, the Hittites were known as Keta. Probably all 3 words would have referred to the same sort of people. At least some of the men fighting alongside Eurypylus might have well been Hittites. Then we have an impression of a larger war than just the siege of Troy. It is said in the Homeric epics that the Achaeans had sacked Teuthranea and later other citadels, such as Lionesus closer to Troy, coming eventually to lay siege upon Troy itself. Troy, however, had been at least in times past a Hittite vassal or Hittite satellite state, and attacking it would have probably angered the Hittite king, even though he is not mentioned in the epics of Homer. The Lycians, under the Homeric hero Sarpedon, had come to the aid of the Trojans, and one might expect that the Hittites may have done the same. The kingdom of Ugarit in Syria and Alashiya, the kingdom of Cyprus, may have also been at war with the Hittites at around the same time, possibly siding with the Achaeans. There is yet another piece of evidence from the epic cycle that may suggest a long-running enmity between the Achaeans and the Hittites. Homer likens Eurypylus, that hero fighting among the Cettians, the presumed Hittites, to Memnon in handsomeness. Memnon was a king among the so-called Ethiopians who had fought Achilles, according to a lost epic, Ethiopes, of which a summary only has survived. Memnon is said to have led an army of Ethiopians. Pausanias, a Greek travel writer of the Hellenistic period, writes, Memnon was a king of the Ethiopian nation. He came to Troy, however, not from Ethiopia, but from Susa in Persia, and from the river Coaspis, having subdued all the peoples that lived between these and Troy. The Phrygians still point out the road through which he led his army. Ethiopian is a compound word made up of the Greek words Hithia and Opsis. Opsis means appearance. Ethia, possibly related also to the word ether, means something like airy, the essence of the sky. It was the air that gods breathed. Memnon was the son of Eos, known in Latin as Aurora, the ancient deity of dawn, while Ethiopia appears to have been a land far to the east from where dawn comes. It had its capital at Susa. Hesiod said that it lied at the end of the world. Another text from the Roman period claimed that Memnon had come at the head of an army of Ethiopians and Indians. At least according to Pausanias, he had nothing much to do with Africa, but rather with a land vaguely placed in the east. Howe and Wells, in their commentary on Herodotus, suggest that the Greek myth of Memnon is a reflection of the great Anatolian Hittite Empire. In this connection, Herodotus mentions a statue attributed to Memnon. He suggests that the attribution to Memnon may be wrong, and the images may rather be of the Egyptian Sessus trees, on account that the images do not look Ethiopian, but rather Egyptian. He mentions in this regard two great reliefs to be found near Ephesus. There are in Ionia 2 figures of this man carved in rock, one on the road from Ephesus to Phocea, and the other on that from Sardis to Smyrna. In both places, the figure is over 20 feet high, with a spear on his right hand and a bow in his left, and the rest of his equipment proportional, for it is both Egyptian and Ethiopian. And right across the breast, from one shoulder to the other, a text is cut in the Egyptian sacred character, saying, I myself won this land with the strength of my shoulders. There is nothing here to show who he is and whence he comes, but it is shown elsewhere. Some of those who have seen these figures suggest they are Memnon, but they are far indeed from the truth. One of these 2 reliefs, perhaps surprisingly, survives to this day, and here it is. Probably influenced by the suggestion of Herodotus, the figure was drawn in the following way by an artist in the 19th century. Rendered by the artist in this way, the figure indeed looks Egyptian, and a hieroglyph is pictured presumably to indicate the alleged statement in Egyptian hieroglyphics mentioned by Herodotus that an inscription said, I myself won this land with the strength of my shoulders. The Hittites had died out 7 centuries before Herodotus lived, and you would have probably not heard anything about them. The pointed hat or crown somewhat resembles those of the Egyptian pharaohs, but it is actually Hittite. The rest of his dress is also Hittite, not Egyptian. The image would have already weathered away by the time of Herodotus, and he would have had about as much trouble as we are having today to recognize what is being depicted. Almost certainly, this is no pharaoh, no Sesostris. Stylistically, it is clearly Hittite. Compare it, for example, with two other Hittite reliefs of a similar type found on the side of Rhodes in modern Turkey. As with the figure of Memnon saw in these cases, symbolism is apposed next to the head of the figure, suggesting its identity. One of these figures is said to have possibly been that of a Hittite agricultural deity. The locals saying to Herodotus that the statues were of Memnon may have been closer to the truth. If so, Memnon was most likely not an Ethiopian from that Ethiopia in Africa, a country possibly that had not received that name yet. Memnon was likely a Hittite, a handsome, ether-faced Ethiopian, perhaps divine king, son of Zeus, the deity of dawn, who ruled in the east. It is perhaps not entirely accidental that Eurypylus was compared to Memnon, and that Eurypylus was accompanied by men described as Cettians or Ketii, that is probably Hittites, who fought and fell alongside him in battle. Himself being the son of Telephus, whom Kelder and others contrast with Telepinu of the Hittite texts, the Hittite commander who had fought the Ahiawa some years earlier, according to the Hittite records. Piecing together these various threads of evidence from archaeology, the epic cycle, and the writings of later classical writers presents us with a picture of intermittent war between the Achaeans and the Hittites or their vassals, finally lapsing into a near total war that ranged from Greece to as far as Ugarit in Syria. Most of the states on the receiving end of the Achaean attack had been Hittite vassals at some point, according to Hittite records. Some may have still been regarded as vassals by the Hittite king. That all-encompassing war would have contributed to the devastation that marks the end of the Bronze Age. An entire civilization may have perished in the flames of that war.